The email notification pops up on my phone at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I'm standing in the conference room of Holbrook Manufacturing, the company my grandfather built in 1968. The room smells like old leather and expensive coffee. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlook the Hudson River. I've been in this room hundreds of times. Today feels different. My hands are shaking, but not from fear. The subject line reads, "Notice of termination of employment." I don't open it immediately. I stare at the words. My brother Martin sits across the table, his face a carefully constructed mask of sympathy. My sister-in-law Catherine sits next to him, her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap. My father's leather chair sits empty, as it has for the past 14 months since his stroke left him unable to speak, unable to understand, locked inside a body that won't obey. "We're doing this for everyone's sake," Martin says. His voice is soft, almost apologetic. "The board has made their decision." I laugh. It's not the laugh of someone who finds something funny. It's the laugh of someone watching the machinery of her own destruction, piece by piece. "The board voted unanimously," Catherine adds. She's smiling. A real smile, not the fake one she uses at charity galas. I close my eyes for 1 second. Just one. And I begin to remember how I got here. 7 years before that email. I was 28 years old, and I was completely in love with my family's company. My name is Alina Holbrook. Growing up, the name Holbrook meant something in this city. My grandfather built an empire manufacturing specialized industrial components. My father expanded it. My brother inherited the presumption that he would run it. And I inherited the expectation that I would help him do that, quietly, from behind. I didn't mind at first. I was too busy to mind. I studied finance at Columbia. Sharp, focused, didn't party much. While other kids my age were doing normal 20-something things, dadding, exploring, making mistakes, I was coming into the office on Saturday mornings, sitting in on board meetings, asking questions no one else was asking. I started in accounts management. Within 2 years, I moved to operations, then supply chain, then strategic planning. By the time I was 25, I was running half of the company's moving pieces, and nobody really noticed. That was the beginning of my problem. In 2016, my father had what he called his come to Jesus meeting with Martin. My brother had been drifting through various departments for years, playing at different roles, never quite landing anywhere. He was charming, smooth, good at golf. These were things our father valued in a way I didn't fully understand until later. Dad sat us both down in his office on a Thursday afternoon. "Martin," he said, "you're going to be Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately." I felt something shift inside my chest, a small crack in the foundation. "Alina," he continued, not meeting my eyes, "I want you to work with your brother. You'll be his number 2, head of strategic operations. That's a huge role. You should be proud." I was proud. I forced my face into the shape of gratitude. But I'd been running strategic operations for 18 months already. Now I would just have a title and someone above me telling me how to do the job I was already doing. "Of course," I said, "I'm honored." That's when I learned my first real lesson about my family. They didn't see me when I was useful. They only saw me when I was essential. And they would spend the rest of my time there making sure I never became too essential, just essential enough. Martin took the COO position like he'd been offered a prize he didn't deserve, because he had. I should have left then, I know that now, but there were complications. My father was aging. My mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. The company was my family's security, and I'd been raised to believe that Holbrook loyalty meant sacrificing your own plans for the sake of the whole. So I stayed. I worked 80-hour weeks. I fixed supply chain issues that cost the company $2 million. I renegotiated contracts. I developed a new market strategy that expanded our client base by 30% in 18 months. I did all of this while sitting one desk away from Martin's corner office, watching him attend golf outings with clients and take credit for my work in board meetings. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that eventually my father would recognize my value. That eventually the company would understand that Martin was a placeholder and I was the future. I was wrong about almost everything. But I was right about one thing. I did understand the company. I knew every system, every vendor, every contract, every weakness, every advantage. By 2017, I was the only person in the building who could operate Hallbrook Manufacturing if everyone else disappeared tomorrow. This knowledge would become very useful. It just took me a while to figure out how to use it properly. In the spring of 2018, my father had his stroke. I was in a supplier meeting in Newark when the call came. My mother, her voice fractured and small, telling me to get to the hospital. I left the meeting mid-sentence. I drove 80 miles per hour with both hands gripping the wheel, thinking the terrible thoughts you think when someone you love might be dying. He survived, but he didn't survive the same. The stroke took away his words, his ability to recognize faces sometimes, his ability to sign documents or attend board meetings. It left him in a body that looked like my father's but contained someone trapped behind glass. During the chaos of hospitals and doctors and rehabilitation facilities, something shifted in my family's structure. My brother stepped up, or that's how everyone described it. He took on more responsibilities. He made more decisions. He started speaking as the voice of the company, the future leader, the natural successor. What he actually did was remove me from every important conversation. It started small. A supplier meeting scheduled during my vacation. "We didn't want to bother you," Martin explained. "Catherine and I handled it." Catherine was his wife. She worked in marketing, a part-time position she'd been given 5 years earlier as a courtesy, one of those do-nothing jobs families give to relatives they like. She had no background in supplier relations. A new contract came through from our biggest client, Kendall Aerospace. This account brought in 23% of our annual revenue. I'd been managing Kendall for 5 years. I knew the account inside and out. The renewal meeting was scheduled without me. "Dad thinks Martin should lead client relations now," Martin told me, and I still don't know if he actually believed my father had said this or if he was just lying directly to my face. By that point, my father couldn't have told anyone anything. He couldn't form the words. Kendall's renewal came through. The contract was less favorable than it should have been. We lost a clause that had protected us in the previous agreement, a clause I would have fought to keep. "It's fine," Martin said when I brought it up. "Kendall's a stable client. We don't need to squeeze them." He was wrong. I knew he was wrong. But I was learning something during this period. Knowing you're right and being able to prove it are two different things. By October, my brother had reduced me to a figurehead with a business card and no actual function. I was still coming in, still working, still trying to be useful, but I was being slowly, systematically erased from the decision-making process of the company I'd been running for 5 years. Catherine made it her personal project. She started small, a comment during a meeting about Elena's conservative approach to risk. Never mind that my conservative approach had kept the company profitable through 3 recessions. Then came the subtle reminders that I was underutilized and probably needed a break and maybe should focus on my personal life. At a partner dinner in November, Catherine introduced me to a colleague's daughter who worked in interior design. "Elena should totally have someone like that," Catherine said brightly. "She spends her whole life at the office. When was the last time you did something fun, Elena? Do you even date?" Everyone laughed. I laughed too. The laugh of someone pretending not to bleed while you watch the knife being turned. My father was in a rehabilitation facility by December. My mother was declining faster than anyone expected. The Alzheimer's wasn't playing by the timeline the doctors had predicted. Within 18 months of my father's stroke, I was essentially alone, not physically alone, but alone in a way that mattered. Alone in a way that made me vulnerable. This is when my brother made his move. In January 2019, there was a board meeting. I attended. I'd been marginalized from decision-making, but I still had a seat. I still had a vote. The agenda item was strategic reorganization. Martin presented the plan with charts and projections. The company would be restructured, new positions created, departments consolidated. On paper, it looked like standard corporate evolution. In reality, it was the architecture of my removal. The Strategic Operations Division, the division I'd built, would be merged with supply chain. A new VP of operations would be hired to oversee both. This person would report directly to Martin, not to me. My role would be redefined as Special Advisor to the COO, a title that meant everything and nothing. I listened to the presentation. I looked at the faces around the table. Thomas Whitmore, the board chairman, was nodding along. Margaret Chen, who'd been a family friend for 20 years, was taking notes. Even Robert Hayes, the CFO, who owed his position to a restructuring plan I designed in 2015, wasn't raising his hand to object. "I'd like to call for a vote," Martin said. And then Catherine, who wasn't even on the board, who had no right to be in that meeting, spoke up from her seat against the wall. "This is the right move," she said. "Alina's been underperforming for a while. She's too detail-oriented, not visionary enough. The company needs fresh perspective." No one corrected her. No one said this was outside protocol. No one told her to be quiet. That's when I knew it was done. The vote passed with 5 in favor, 1 abstention, Margaret, and my hand alone in the air, voting against my own dissolution. I walked out of that meeting, and I understood something clear and complete. My family had never seen me as anything more than a resource to be used, a useful tool while the tool was sharp, and a dull tool once they were done sharpening themselves on it. Special advisor meant I had an office and a salary and a title that sounded important to people who didn't know the company. It meant I was completely powerless. The new VP of operations was hired in February. His name was David Kincaid, and he was the kind of executive who traveled with a reputation, charismatic, results-driven, and completely incompetent at actual operations. He'd worked at 3 other companies, stayed at each for 18 to 24 months, and left amid some kind of unspecified disagreement each time. Martin loved him immediately. Catherine threw a welcome dinner at their house in March. I was invited, which surprised me. I went, which surprised everyone else. During dinner, Catherine made a point of seating me away from the main conversation. I ended up talking to David's wife about Pilates and vacation homes, while my brother regaled the table with stories about shaking things up at Hallbrook and cutting out unnecessary overhead. I knew what that meant. That meant me. The first meeting with David, I tried to be helpful. I brought him reports on vendor relationships, client accounts, quarterly projections, information he would need to actually understand the business. He smiled and set them aside. "I like to come in fresh," he said. "Start with a clean slate. Too many legacy systems get in the way." Those legacy systems had been keeping the company profitable, but I'd learned by then that facts were not as powerful as narrative, and Martin had spent 4 months building a narrative where I was the problem. By April, David had fired 4 people in my former department, good people who'd been with the company for years. He was replacing them with consultants who reported to him, creating a parallel structure that had nothing to do with the company's actual operations. It was a classic power play. New executive eliminates the people who know too much. Then came the email. It was sent to the entire company, a restructuring announcement. The Strategic Operations Division would be consolidated with supply chain oversight, and new reporting structures would be streamlined for maximum efficiency. Translated, I was being removed from anything that mattered. But worse than the email was what came after. A colleague from accounting, Janet, pulled me aside in the break room. "You should see what people are saying in the group chat," she whispered. She looked uncomfortable, embarrassed for me. I asked her what they were saying. "Just, people are wondering why you're still here if you're not actually doing anything. Someone made a joke that you're basically the help now. Like, your family keeps you around to look important, but you don't actually." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. That night, I went home to my apartment in Murray Hill. It was a nice apartment. It had a view of the city. I'd spent most of my money on it because the company was my life, and this apartment was where I slept when the company wasn't enough. I sat on my couch with my laptop, and I found the chat. Slack workspace, channel called water cooler, messages from people I worked with every day, people who'd come to me for advice, people I'd helped hire and train. They'd decided I was incompetent, that Martin was brilliant for sidelining me, that David was going to save the company from whatever it was I'd supposedly been doing wrong. One message made me stop reading. It was from Marcus, a guy I'd actually mentored when he started 5 years ago. He was now in client relations. Honestly, I think Alina's always been a bottleneck, he'd written. She wanted to control everything. David's approach is so much better. He lets us actually make decisions. The decisions David was letting them make were the reason our biggest client, Kendall Aerospace, had already started exploring other suppliers. But they didn't know that. They only knew what they'd been told. I closed the chat. I opened my bank account and looked at my balance. $834,000. It was good money. It was savings from my salary, bonuses, and some inheritance from my grandfather. It was not nothing. But I thought about my father, trapped in that rehabilitation facility, unable to speak. I thought about my mother, slowly disappearing inside her own mind. I thought about how much of that money I'd spent taking care of them, because my brother certainly wasn't doing it. And I thought about how much of my life I'd spent building something that had decided I was the help. The humiliation was the gasoline. But what came next was the match. I stopped crying on a Thursday. I'd been crying on and off for a week, in my apartment, in the car, once in a bathroom stall at the office. The kind of crying that comes from feeling fundamentally betrayed by everyone you've ever trusted. But on Thursday, while I was waiting for my mother's afternoon rehabilitation appointment, something switched off inside me. My mother was sitting in a chair by the window, looking at something I couldn't see. She used to be sharp, brilliant, even. Now she couldn't remember my name most days. But sometimes in her eyes, I'd see a flash of the person she used to be, like someone trapped behind a wall of glass, trying to get out. I sat down next to her. "Hi, Mom," I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were blank. "It's Alina, your daughter." "Oh," she said, and then she looked back out the window. I sat there for an hour, saying nothing, just being present in a way that had stopped mattering to anyone else in my life. When I left, I wasn't sad anymore. I was something else. I was clear. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. That moment when you stop hopping people will be better and start planning for the reality of who they actually are. It's like a fever breaking. You feel cold for a moment, but then you feel strong. I drove home. I made coffee. I opened a blank document on my computer, and I started to think like someone who had nothing left to lose, which meant I could think like someone who had everything to gain. The first thing I did was make a list of what I knew. I knew that David Kincaid had been hired by my brother specifically to sideline me. I knew that David didn't understand our operations, which meant he was going to make mistakes. I knew that those mistakes would cost the company money, and eventually, someone would notice. I knew that our biggest client account, Kendall Aerospace, was about to renew their contract with a competing supplier because of the mistakes Martin had made during their renewal. I knew this because I still received forwarded emails from people in the department who didn't fully understand the transition, and one of those emails had been from the Kendall account manager saying that our competitor had submitted a proposal. I knew that Catherine had no actual authority, which meant she was operating on false confidence, and false confidence makes people careless. I knew that my father's estate was still unclear, that my mother's medical care was expensive, and that my brother had access to company funds that should have been earmarked for both parents' care. I knew that I had a 5-year history of being the architect of every successful strategic move the company had made, and I knew that history was documented in emails, presentations, and board meeting minutes. And I knew something else. I was still the only person in the building who actually understood how the company worked. I opened a spreadsheet. Over the next 3 weeks, I began the process of collecting information, not in a desperate way, not in anger, in the calm, systematic way you collect data for a presentation. I went through my email archive and compiled a timeline of every major decision I'd made, every successful initiative, every problem I'd solved. I cross-referenced it with the company's financial performance. The pattern was obvious. When I was driving strategy, the company grew. When my influence was removed, our performance started to decline. I created backup files, copies of documents, contracts, communications. I put them all in encrypted folders on a personal hard drive. If I was going to prove anything later, I needed evidence now, while I still had access. I started to really pay attention in meetings, in a way I hadn't been able to before. When you're trying to save something, you're not really seeing it. Now that I'd stopped trying to save it, I could actually see it clearly. David Kincaid was gutting our supplier relationships. He was cutting corners with vendors we'd worked with for a decade, people who trusted us, to save money that looked good on his quarterly reports. Those savings would cost us far more later, but his quarterly reports wouldn't be his responsibility. They'd be whoever came after him. My brother was making decisions based on what Catherine told him. And Catherine was making decisions based on what sounded impressive at dinner parties, not what was actually true. The culture of the company was shifting, not upward, down. I watched this unfold with the detachment of someone watching a car crash in slow motion. Horrible, but also sort of fascinating. By May, something interesting happened. Kendall Aerospace formally terminated their contract with Holbrook Manufacturing. They didn't do it angrily, just professionally. They'd found a supplier who could meet their needs better. They thanked us for 10 years of business. 23% of our revenue, gone. The news hit the board meeting like a bomb. How did this happen? Thomas Whitmore, the board chairman, was genuinely shocked. This was one of our most stable accounts. Martin was pale. We had David handle the renewal negotiations. Everyone looked at David. The account was asking for terms that weren't sustainable, David said smoothly. I made a business decision that was in the company's best interest. You made a decision that cost us millions, Margaret Chen said flatly. I was sitting quietly in my corner. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't speak. I just listened and took notes. After the meeting, as people were filing out, Martin approached me. You managed Kendall before, he said. His voice had changed. There was something desperate in it. Do you think there's any way to get them back? I looked at him, really looked at him. At this man who'd had everything handed to him, who'd thrown away the company our grandfather built because he was too proud to admit that I understood it better than he did. I don't know, I said. I'm not really managing accounts anymore. He flinched. Right, well, if you have any ideas. I'll think about it, I said. I was already thinking about it. Not because I wanted to save the company, but because saving it would require a very specific sequence of events that would expose exactly how badly everyone had failed. This was the beginning of my actual plan. I became invisible. That sounds strange, but I mean it quite literally. I was still in the building. I still had my office, but I stopped trying to be heard. I stopped attending meetings unless specifically required. I stopped offering solutions or advice. I became the background of the company's life, white noise, unimportant. People stopped noticing me almost immediately. And when people stop noticing you, you can do almost anything. My first move was a conversation with Thomas Whitmore, the board chairman. I asked to meet with him privately. He seemed surprised. We hadn't had a one-on-one conversation in months, but he agreed. I went into his office prepared. I had documents. I had timelines. I had data. I want to show you something, I said. And I want you to understand that I'm not doing this out of anger or because I'm upset about the reorganization. Okay, he said carefully. I showed him the timeline, every major initiative I'd led, every client relationship I'd managed, every supplier problem I'd solved. The correlation between my involvement and company growth was stark. Not subtle, not arguable. Stark. "This is interesting," Thomas said, "but Martin's been the figurehead," I interrupted, as politely as I could. "Which is fine. Companies need figureheads, but figureheads shouldn't make strategic decisions." I then showed him Kendall. When I was managing this account, we had 93% client satisfaction, strong margins, stable growth. The renewal was supposed to secure the contract for another 3 years with a 5% rate increase. I had the terms negotiated. I had the proposal ready. I was taken off the account before the final meeting. "By whom?" Thomas asked. "By my brother. He said he wanted to lead client relations." The new terms that were negotiated. Do you want to know what happened? I explained the missing clause, the one that had protected us in fluctuating markets. Without it, we had no flexibility. Kendall wanted more flexibility. We wouldn't give it to them, so they left. "Why am I just hearing about this now?" Thomas asked. "Because I was told this decision was above my pay grade," I said. "And it was, technically, but I wanted you to see the pattern. I've been systematically removed from every decision that matters, and since I've been removed, the company's prospects have declined." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want, Alina?" he asked finally. "I want to fix Kendall," I said. "Not to save my position, not even to save the company, honestly. I want to fix it because I know I can. And I want the board to understand what the difference looks like between the people who actually know the business and the people who are just managing the appearance of knowing the business." Thomas agreed to let me try to salvage Kendall. It took 3 weeks and a lot of very careful negotiation, but I got them back. Not with the same terms. Kendall had moved on and they wanted changes, but with a contract that was actually stronger for both parties, more flexible, more sustainable. When the new contract came to the board for approval, Thomas made a point of mentioning who'd brought Kendall back. Martin's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, then something that looked like fear. "That's wonderful news," David said smoothly. "Maybe we should have Alina take on more account management responsibilities." I watched him make this offer like a shark throwing a piece of meat to a smaller shark, trying to distract from the fact that he was still bleeding out. "I appreciate that," I said, "but I'm happy in my current role." My current role was still meaningless, but now people knew I could do something they couldn't. The second part of my preparation was more careful. I'd noticed that my brother and Catherine were hemorrhaging money in ways that couldn't be explained by normal business operations. They were taking executive retreats. They were hiring consultants for projects that didn't exist. Catherine was doing a design project for their house and billing it to the company as a corporate event space renovation. These were small crimes, not the kind of thing that would get someone prosecuted, but they were the kind of thing that would look very bad if examined closely by the board. I started to document these expenses, politely, calmly, just nodding them in memos to the finance department, asking for clarification, following up on invoices, creating a paper trail. By June, I had compiled a file on the Kendall contract restoration and a second file on questionable company expenses that I couldn't quite explain. 2 different narratives. One was about my value to the company. The other was about my brother's incompetence and potential financial mismanagement. I wasn't planning to use either of these files yet. I was waiting for the final piece. The final piece came when I visited my father. He was in a nursing home by June. His condition had stabilized, but his prognosis hadn't improved. He would likely never speak again. He would never go home. He would just live in this state, trapped in a body that worked but a mind that couldn't quite reach the world. I sat with him on a Tuesday afternoon. "Hi, Dad," I said. He looked at me. Sometimes there was recognition in his eyes. Sometimes there wasn't. "I want to tell you what's happening," I said. "I don't know if you can understand, but I want to tell you anyway." I told him about Martin, about David, about the way the company was collapsing, about the expenses, about Kendall, about the fact that his life's work was being dismantled by people who didn't understand it or care about it. "I'm going to fix it," I said. "Not for you, not really, but I wanted you to know. I wanted you to understand that I'm not broken, I'm not incapable, I'm not the help, I'm the one who actually knows." My father made a sound, a small grunt. His eyes focused on me for a moment, and I could see something in there, maybe recognition, maybe not. Maybe just the reflex of a body responding to stimuli. I held his hand. "I'm going to prove it," I said. In July, an auditor came to Holbrook Manufacturing. Not a regular auditor, not someone we'd hired. A forensic auditor sent by Thomas Whitmore to examine the company's financial records. "It's just routine," Thomas told the board. "We haven't had a full external audit in 18 months. Good governance." It wasn't routine, and everyone knew it. The auditor was a woman named Sandra Petras, and she was very good at her job. She spent 2 weeks going through our books. She interviewed department heads. She examined invoices. She traced the flow of money. And she found something I didn't expect. It wasn't the Kendall situation. That had been fixed. It was something much worse. My brother hadn't just been stealing from the company in small ways. He'd been doing it in big ways. Strategic loans to business interests associated with him and Catherine. Consulting fees paid to shell companies. Equipment purchases that had been billed to multiple departments. It added up to nearly $800,000 over 2 years. Not all at once, not in a way that immediately screamed theft, but in a pattern that, when examined closely, showed a clear and systematic misappropriation of company funds. When Sandra presented her findings to the board, my brother wasn't in the room. I was. Sandra was professional, unemotional. She presented data. She showed documents. She explained the pattern. "In my professional opinion," she concluded, "there has been deliberate financial mismanagement. Whether it rises to the level of intentional fraud would be a matter for legal counsel and potentially law enforcement to determine. But it's clearly problematic." Thomas Whitmore looked sick. "How did this happen?" Margaret Chen demanded. "Who approved these expenses?" "Martin Holbrook," Sandra said simply. "He approved all of them. As COO, he has that authority. But the expenses themselves appear designed to avoid scrutiny. They're distributed across departments, invoiced to different entities, coded to different budget lines." "He was hiding it," I said. It was the first time I'd spoken. Everyone looked at me. "I'm not sure I follow," Thomas said. "He was hiding it because he knew it was wrong," I said. "If he thought these expenses were legitimate, he wouldn't have scattered them across different departments. He would have just explained them." "Elena," Margaret said carefully, "I know you and your brother have had some tension." "I don't care about my brother," I said, and I meant it. "I care about the company, and I care about the fact that you hired David Kincaid to drive me out, and now you're learning that the man who hired him might be committing fraud." Sandra cleared her throat. "There's more," she said. Everyone turned back to her. "I found something else. In the executive expense account. Payments to a legal firm, Morrison and Associates. I contacted them. They appear to have been retained to investigate potential environmental compliance issues related to our manufacturing facilities." Environmental compliance issues. Thomas looked at Sandra like she was speaking another language. "Apparently, there are some concerns about waste disposal at our New Jersey facility," Sandra said. "This was apparently discovered about 8 months ago, and Martin retained legal counsel without informing the board." The room went silent. "Environmental issues can cost millions," Sandra continued. "The legal fees alone suggest it's serious. But because it wasn't disclosed, the board has been making financial decisions without full information about the company's actual liabilities." I felt the ground shift. This wasn't something I had orchestrated. This wasn't something I had known about. My brother had been hiding something far worse than embezzled money. He'd been hiding a liability that could have affected every decision the board made. "Does anyone else know about this?" Thomas asked. "The legal firm, presumably," Sandra said. And whoever at the New Jersey facility first identified the issue. But it doesn't appear to be in any official company documentation. Nothing was reported to the board. Thomas stood up. "Suspend this meeting," he said. "We need to speak with legal counsel immediately, and someone needs to locate Martin and inform him that his position is suspended pending further investigation." As people were gathering their things, preparing to leave, Margaret touched my arm. "How much did you know about this?" she asked quietly. "About the environmental issue? Nothing," I said. "About the suspicious expenses, I'd noticed them, but I didn't know the extent." "Did you set this up?" she asked. "The audit, I mean. Did you convince Thomas to do this?" I looked at her. "I showed Thomas some financial information," I said. "I suggested that a full external audit might be prudent, but I didn't know what he would find." It was mostly true. I hadn't known about the environmental issue. I hadn't known about the full extent of the misappropriation. I'd suspected something was wrong, but I hadn't known what. Which meant I'd effectively detonated a bomb, without knowing exactly what was in the bomb. And I realized something, standing in that conference room as people rushed around me, making phone calls, opening emergency folders. I didn't actually need to do anything else. My brother had done it for me. He'd destroyed himself. All I'd done was turn on the light. The board moved very fast. They suspended Martin immediately, pending investigation. They suspended David Kincaid on the grounds that his hearing might have been part of a broader pattern of financial mismanagement. They froze certain accounts. They contacted the state environmental agency about the waste disposal issue. And they asked me to come into an emergency meeting with Thomas, Margaret, and Sandra. "We need you to take over as interim COO," Thomas said. "Just for the short term while we sort through this mess. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said, no hesitation, no drama. "We're going to need you to work with legal counsel," Margaret added, "and probably with law enforcement. This is going to get messy." "I understand," I said. What I understood was that I was being asked to clean up the disaster that my family had made. That I was being asked to step back into the role I'd been doing all along, just with a title and a paycheck that reflected the actual work. It wasn't justice, exactly, but it was something. Over the next 3 days, I made my first decisions as COO. I restored the Strategic Operations Division to its original structure. I brought back the people David had fired, offering them their jobs back with apologies and raises. I began the process of repairing the supplier relationships David had damaged. I met with our remaining major clients and assured them that the company was stable and that their accounts would be managed with the professionalism they deserved. I worked 18-hour days. And on the 4th day, my brother came to see me. He was in the office early, before anyone else arrived. He came directly to my office. He didn't knock. "What did you do?" he asked. I looked up at him from my desk. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished. "I did my job," I said. "You planted that auditor. You set this up." I suggested to Thomas that the company should have an external audit. That's something every responsible board should do. Whether he did it because of that suggestion or because he simply thought it was good governance, I don't know. "You knew what he would find," Martin said. His voice was shaking. "I suspected you were taking money," I said calmly. "I had documentation of some questionable expenses, but I didn't know about the environmental issue. I didn't know how deep it went. If I'm being honest, I didn't know you were this stupid." He flinched. "The company was going to collapse because of David," I continued. "Because you hired someone incompetent to get rid of me, and you hid an environmental liability instead of dealing with it. You did that, not me." "Catherine convinced me," he said. "She said I needed to establish authority, and you were always." "Stop," I said. "Don't do that. Don't pretend Catherine made you do this. You made your own choices. You chose to believe her because it was easier than admitting that I understood the business better than you do. You chose to hide the environmental issue because you were embarrassed about it. You chose to embezzle from the company because you thought you could get away with it. Those were your choices." Martin sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. "They're going to prosecute me," he said. It sounded like he was just realizing this. "Probably," I said, "if the financial crimes are serious enough." "What are you going to do?" he asked. I thought about this. "I'm going to run the company," I said. "I'm going to fix what you broke, and when everything's fixed, I'm going to step down and let someone else take over, because I don't want this anymore. I don't want to spend my life managing your mistakes." He looked at me like I was speaking another language. "You're not going to help me?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm not going to help you, and I'm not going to hurt you, but I'm also not going to pretend we're brothers anymore. I'm going to acknowledge the reality, which is that you were given everything and you threw it away, and I was given nothing and I built something with it. And now you're going to face the consequences of your choices, and I'm going to move on." He left my office without another word. I didn't watch him go. 3 months later, the situation had stabilized. The environmental issue was worse than anyone initially thought. Cleanup was going to cost approximately $2.3 million, but it was manageable. The company could absorb it. It would hurt, but it wouldn't kill us. The financial crimes investigation was ongoing. Martin's lawyer was negotiating with prosecutors. Depending on how the negotiations went, he might face charges. The embezzlement was documented and systematic. Even if he tried to argue that the money was legitimate business expenses, the numbers didn't support that narrative. Catherine had quietly separated from him and started working on getting control of their assets before any judgments could be issued. David Kincaid had been fired. He'd already moved on to another company. That company would learn what I'd learned. He was very good at looking competent and very bad at actually being competent. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I'd been officially appointed as COO, not interim, not temporary, but permanently. The board had offered me the title because I'd proven something that couldn't be argued with. I could do the job. But more importantly, I'd proven something else. I didn't actually need them. I could walk away tomorrow and land on my feet. I had money, experience, skills, and reputation. The company needed me more than I needed the company. This was the crucial shift. I was no longer someone fighting to maintain a position that wasn't mine. I was someone who had a position because she was the only one qualified to have it. There was a difference. The difference was power. The last thing I did, 3 days before my official appointment as COO was finalized, was visit my father. He was in the same chair by the window. I sat down next to him. "I wanted you to know," I said. "I fixed it. I ran the audit. I made them see what was really happening. Martin's probably going to face charges. The environmental issue is being managed. The company's going to be okay." I paused. "I know you can't really understand this, and I know you wouldn't approve if you could, because you'd want me to be loyal to my brother or to forgive him or something like that. But I'm telling you anyway, because I want you to know that the person you always thought was the problem wasn't. I was the person who held everything together the whole time." My father made a small sound, that small grunt. "I don't think you understand," I said, "but I know you hear me, and that's enough." I held his hand for an hour. When I left, I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was tired, the way you're tired after you've been holding your breath for a very long time and suddenly you can breathe again. It's been 8 months since I became COO. The company is profitable again. Not as profitable as it was when I was running it invisibly, but close. We've attracted new clients. We've restored relationships with suppliers. We've begun the process of becoming something better than what it was. I've hired new people who understand operations, people who understand strategy, people who won't be dazzled by David Kincaid types because they actually know what good looks like. Martin's legal situation is still ongoing, but it's clear now that he'll probably take a plea deal. Reduced charges, probably some jail time, definitely financial restitution. His wife has filed for divorce and has already positioned herself as the injured party in all of this. She'll probably come out okay. People like Catherine always do. I have a new apartment. Not huge, not showy, but mine. Real art on the walls. Furniture I actually like. A view that matters to me for reasons I can articulate, not because it impresses people. I was offered a dinner by Thomas Whitmore, a celebration. To honor my leadership, he called it. I declined. Why not? He asked, genuinely puzzled. Because I don't need validation from you, I said. I know what I'm capable of. I've known it for a long time. I don't need a dinner to prove it to myself. The look on his face was interesting. It was the look of someone realizing that the person they'd been dismissing had actually been better than them all along, and that person was never going to care what they thought. That was fine. I don't hate my family anymore. Hate requires engagement. I've disengaged. I run the company because I'm good at it and because there's nothing else that needs my attention right now. I see my parents because they're my parents, but I don't expect anything from them anymore. I don't hope they'll apologize. I don't hope they'll recognize what I did for them. I know who they are, and I've accepted it. The best revenge wasn't the audit or the exposure or the legal consequences, though those were satisfying in their own way. The best revenge was success. Not success despite them, but success that they'll never be able to achieve. Success that will be here long after they're gone. Success that proves, absolutely and undeniably, that the person they decided was the help was actually the architect of everything they ever had. I'm sitting at my desk now, looking at the quarterly reports. Numbers that represent supply chains and client relationships and vendor negotiations. Numbers that represent the work of my mind and my hands, even when no one was crediting me for it. Especially then.